The moment someone tells you your land belongs to their schedule instead of your family, they have already made the mistake that will destroy them. My name is Ethan Walker, and I learned that lesson on a humid Thursday afternoon when I rounded the last bend in my gravel driveway, expecting nothing more exciting than checking my irrigation pumps before sunset. Instead, the ground beneath my pickup trembled with a slow, heavy vibration that I had never felt on our farm before. At first I thought distant thunder was rolling across the hills, but the sky was bright blue with only scattered white clouds drifting above the pasture. Then I heard the unmistakable growl of diesel engines. One after another, massive cement trucks appeared beyond the old oak trees, their rotating drums glistening beneath the afternoon sun as they rolled straight across my family's hay field. Thick gray dust drifted behind their oversized tires, and every turn of those wheels pressed deep into soil my grandfather used to call the heart of our ranch. I stopped my truck so suddenly that gravel scattered beneath the tires. For a second, I simply sat there with both hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to convince myself I had misunderstood what I was seeing. Then I noticed a temporary construction gate standing wide open where my fence should have been secured. Bright orange safety stakes lined a path cutting directly across my property toward the new subdivision rising beyond the western tree line. Standing beside the gate was Diane Collins, the president of the neighboring Homeowners Association, wearing a navy blazer despite the summer heat and calmly pointing construction vehicles toward my pasture as though she had been directing traffic there for years. She looked up, noticed my truck, and offered the kind of polite smile people wear when they assume they have already won. One of the drivers slowed long enough to wave apologetically before following her directions across my land. The smell of fresh concrete mixed with dry grass and warm dirt, creating a combination I had never experienced in more than 4 decades of living on that ranch. I climbed out of my truck and walked toward the gate without raising my voice. My boots sank slightly into the fresh tire tracks, each one leaving behind a wide scar stretching across ground my family had protected through 4 generations. Diane greeted me as though we were neighbors discussing the weather instead of strangers standing in the middle of an unauthorized construction route. She explained that the subdivision's regular access road had become too congested, so the contractors needed a temporary shortcut for only a few days. She spoke confidently, almost casually, as though the decision had already become permanent simply because heavy equipment had started moving. I asked one simple question. Who gave you permission to cross my farm? She glanced toward the trucks, folded her arms, and answered without hesitation. Everyone understands this is the fastest solution. She never actually answered my question. While another cement truck rumbled past us, I looked down and noticed a bright orange survey stake driven into the edge of my pasture only a few feet from my boots. Someone had tied fluorescent ribbon around the top so construction vehicles could follow the route easily. That little stake looked insignificant compared with the enormous trucks surrounding it, but something about it made me stop thinking emotionally and start thinking carefully. My father always said the smallest marker on a property often tells the biggest story if you know who placed it there and why. I quietly pulled my phone from my pocket and began recording everything without saying another word because deep inside I already knew those orange stakes would matter far more than anyone standing at that gate realized. I kept recording until the last cement truck disappeared beyond the rise leading toward the subdivision. Then I slowly lowered my phone and looked across the field in complete silence. Deep tire tracks stretched through nearly 600 yards of pasture, cutting across land that had never needed pavement because it had never belonged to anyone except my family. Most people who drove past our ranch saw open grass, scattered oak trees, and an old red barn standing against the Texas sky. They never realized every acre carried a story older than any neighborhood surrounding it. My great-grandfather bought the original 80 acres shortly after returning from military service, clearing the first sections by hand before adding irrigation ditches that followed the natural slope of the land. My grandfather expanded the ranch without changing the drainage system because he understood that water always remembered where it wanted to go. My father taught me the same lesson before I was old enough to drive a tractor. He would point toward the shallow ditches running across the pasture and remind me that they looked ordinary only because they worked exactly as they were designed. During heavy storms, they quietly carried thousands of gallons of runoff away from the fields, protecting the barns, the fences, and every inch of grazing land. If anyone filled them, blocked them, or drove heavy equipment across them repeatedly, the ground beneath would eventually become unstable even if the damage remained invisible at first. That afternoon, I walked beside one of those drainage channels and watched muddy tire prints pressed directly across it. Fresh concrete had dripped from one of the rotating drums, leaving gray patches scattered across the grass like permanent fingerprints. The air still smelled of wet cement mixed with crushed hay, and every few seconds another distant engine echoed from inside the new subdivision. Construction had been growing steadily for almost 2 years on the neighboring property after a development company purchased several hundred acres beyond our western fence line. At first, everything stayed exactly where the county plat said it belonged. Contractors used their own entrance roads, delivery trucks followed approved construction routes, and our relationship remained respectful. Then the Homeowners Association officially formed, and Diane Collins became its first president before most families had even finished moving into their new houses. She attended county meetings, spoke confidently about improving the community, and gradually started acting as though every nearby property existed to support the neighborhood's convenience. Small things appeared. First, survey crews occasionally wandered too close to my fence before apologizing. Landscaping crews parked near my entrance without asking. Delivery drivers turned around in my driveway because navigation applications suggested it was faster. None of those incidents lasted long enough to become serious. This was different. Someone had intentionally opened a temporary access point through my fence line, marked a transportation route with orange stakes, and directed fully loaded cement trucks across ground engineered for drainage instead of commercial traffic. As the sun dropped lower behind the trees, I crouched beside one of the fluorescent markers and examined it carefully. There was no county identification tag attached to it, no licensed survey company name, and no construction permit number anywhere on the stake. It looked official from a distance, but up close it raised more questions than answers. I stood, brushed the dirt from my jeans, and looked toward the subdivision one more time. Diane Collins believed she had solved a construction problem with the simplest shortcut available. She did not realize she had driven those trucks across the one part of my property my father always warned me never to ignore, because the land itself had a longer memory than anyone who tried to take the easy way across it. The next morning I was awake before sunrise, not because I had slept well, but because I wanted to see exactly how many vehicles would use the shortcut once nobody expected me to be watching. The air carried the familiar smell of damp grass and cedar after a cool night, and a light breeze rippled across the pasture as the first rays of sunlight reached the top of the old windmill. I parked my pickup behind the equipment shed where it could not easily be seen from the temporary construction entrance and positioned a small camera overlooking the section of fence that had been opened. Less than 30 minutes later, the first diesel engine echoed across the fields. Another cement truck rolled through the gap without slowing, followed by a dump truck carrying crushed gravel and a flatbed hauling construction materials. Each vehicle followed the same path, marked by the bright orange stakes, crossing directly over the shallow drainage channels my father had spent years protecting. I recorded every minute without stepping into the roadway or attempting to stop anyone. The drivers were simply following directions. My concern was not with them. It was with the people giving those directions. By late morning, the once smooth pasture looked completely different. Deep ruts curved across the field where heavy tires had compressed the soil, and several sections of grass had been torn away entirely, exposing dark clay beneath the surface. One drainage channel had begun collapsing along the edges where repeated weight had broken the compacted banks. Standing there, I could almost hear my father's voice reminding me that damaged drainage never announces itself immediately. It waits until the right storm arrives. Around noon, I watched Diane Collins arrive in a white sport utility vehicle. She stepped out carrying a clipboard and spoke briefly with one of the construction supervisors before pointing confidently toward my pasture once again. She never looked in my direction. From where I stood, hidden behind a row of cedar trees, I photographed every conversation, every truck entering the property, every temporary marker, and every fresh set of tire tracks crossing private land. I also noticed something even more important. The construction entrance they had created was not connected to any paved county road. Instead, workers had simply removed a section of my wire fence, and laid temporary steel construction plates over the ditch beside the property line to create their own crossing point. There was no permanent access road, no official gate, and no visible permit posted anywhere near the entrance. That afternoon, I drove into town instead of confronting anyone. At the county clerk's office, I requested copies of every recorded easement affecting my ranch, every recent construction permit issued for the neighboring subdivision, and every publicly available site development plan connected to the project. The clerk recognized my family name immediately and disappeared into the records room before returning with several large document folders. As I began comparing legal descriptions with the maps spread across the counter, one detail immediately stood out. Every approved construction access route entered the subdivision from the opposite side of the development using an existing county road nearly 2 miles away. My pasture did not appear on a single approved access map. I requested certified copies of every relevant document before leaving the courthouse with a growing folder tucked beneath my arm. Driving home beneath the fading afternoon sun, I realized Diane Collins had not simply chosen a convenient shortcut. She had chosen one that existed nowhere inside the official county records, and that difference was about to become far more important than the tire tracks crossing my field. That evening, I spread every certified map across the large oak table my father built more than 30 years earlier. The fading sunlight coming through the kitchen windows illuminated layers of survey drawings, legal descriptions, drainage diagrams, and construction permits that most people would have considered painfully boring. To me, they felt like pieces of a puzzle that had finally begun fitting together. I traced every property line with the edge of a ruler, comparing the original county plat filed decades ago with the newest subdivision plans. Every document told the same story. My western fence marked the exact boundary of our ranch. Beyond it belonged the developer. Everything inside it belonged to my family. There was no recorded easement. There was no temporary access agreement. There was no emergency construction authorization. There was nothing giving anyone permission to move heavy commercial vehicles across my pasture. I reached into an old cabinet and removed another folder that had not been opened since my father passed away several years earlier. Inside were handwritten maintenance notes, photographs from major storms, and yellowed sketches of the original drainage system drawn in neat pencil long before computers replaced drafting tables. One page immediately caught my attention. Across the top, my father had written a single sentence in block letters. Never change the water because the water never forgets. Beneath those words, he had carefully marked every drainage channel crossing the property, including the exact section now covered with fresh tire tracks. He had even noted the type of clay beneath each field and explained how heavy equipment could compress the soil enough to force water into unexpected directions after sustained rainfall. I remembered standing beside him as a teenager while he pointed toward those shallow ditches, explaining that people often underestimated them because they appeared ordinary during dry weather. He used to smile whenever neighbors suggested filling them to create smoother pasture. Then he would quietly answer that nature always collected payment later, usually during the first hard rain. The following morning, I contacted a retired county engineer named Thomas Grady, a man who had inspected drainage systems across the county for nearly 4 decades before retiring. He had known my father well and agreed to stop by after lunch. We spent nearly 2 hours walking the pasture together. He knelt beside the compressed tire tracks, pressed his hand into the packed soil, and slowly shook his head. He measured several drainage channels, examined the temporary steel plates placed across one crossing, and photographed every orange survey stake standing along the construction route. Finally, he stood, brushed the dirt from his jeans, and looked across the pasture toward the subdivision. Without raising his voice, he said something I will never forget. He told me the trucks were not simply crossing my property. They were crossing one of the most sensitive drainage corridors on the ranch. If enough weight continued moving over those channels before the next major storm, restoring the original water flow would become significantly more complicated. I asked him whether restoring the drainage exactly as it appeared on the original county plans would create any legal concerns. He smiled slightly before pointing toward the certified maps I carried beneath my arm. He explained that a property owner always had both the right and the responsibility to maintain approved drainage according to the recorded design, especially if outside activity had damaged it. As he drove away that afternoon, I looked once more at the orange stakes stretching across the pasture. Diane Collins believed they marked the beginning of her easiest construction route. I was beginning to understand they actually marked the exact location where every official document in the county agreed my family had always been right. I did not call a lawyer the next morning because I already knew the strongest argument was not going to come from a courtroom. It was going to come from the land itself. Before sunrise, I unlocked the equipment shed, started my old excavator, and drove slowly toward the western pasture with a folder containing certified county records secured inside the cab. Every measurement I planned to make had already existed on paper for decades. I was not creating anything new. I was restoring something that had always been there before construction traffic flattened it into the surrounding field. Using my father's handwritten sketches alongside the official drainage survey, I carefully located each original channel, measuring every distance twice before lowering the bucket into the packed soil. The first scoop released dark, damp earth carrying the rich smell that only healthy farmland seems to hold. Inch by inch, the shallow drainage corridor began taking its original shape again. It was never intended to be deep enough to trap vehicles or dangerous enough to threaten anyone. Its only purpose was exactly what it had always been designed to do: collect rainwater and guide it safely across the property before emptying into the natural creek beyond the eastern fence line. By mid-morning, the orange construction stakes stood beside freshly restored drainage channels that matched the county drawings almost perfectly. I photographed every stage of the work, recorded video from multiple angles, and placed bright warning markers along the restored crossings so no reasonable person could claim they had not been visible. I even installed temporary signs stating that private property restoration was underway and directing unauthorized traffic to use approved construction entrances. The signs faced directly toward the opening where the contractors had been entering my ranch all week. Shortly after lunch, a pickup truck carrying 2 construction supervisors stopped near the broken section of fence. One of them stepped out, looked at the restored drainage channel, and asked why I was digging across the route they had been using. I calmly handed him copies of the county maps and explained that I was restoring my legally recorded drainage system after repeated unauthorized heavy traffic damaged it. He studied the paperwork for several moments before admitting he had never seen any authorization allowing trucks onto my land in the first place. He thanked me, returned the documents, and drove away without another argument. I believed the message had finally reached the people making decisions. Unfortunately, I underestimated how strongly convenience can influence judgment. Late that afternoon, I watched from a distance as Diane Collins arrived once again. She spent only a few minutes speaking with workers before gesturing toward my pasture exactly as she had the day before. Even from several hundred feet away, I could see one supervisor pointing toward the warning signs while another appeared to explain something using the documents I had provided earlier. Diane barely glanced at the restored drainage channel before shaking her head and motioning toward the temporary entrance. Her confidence never seemed to waver. As the afternoon faded into evening, I completed the final measurements, packed away my equipment, and stood quietly beside the restored channel while a gentle breeze moved through the tall grass surrounding it. Everything matched the original survey. Every warning marker remained clearly visible. Every photograph carried a timestamp. Every county record supported the work I had completed. Looking across the pasture, I realized the next chapter of this story would not be written by me. It would be written by whoever decided whether respecting clearly marked private property was more important than saving a few minutes on a construction schedule. The weather changed 2 days later exactly the way my father used to predict without ever checking a forecast. Before dawn, the air felt unusually heavy. The birds stayed quiet longer than normal, and a steady breeze carried the sharp scent of approaching rain across the pasture. By mid-morning, dark clouds had settled over the western hills, and the first slow drops began tapping against the roof of my equipment shed. I stood beneath the overhang with a cup of coffee, watching water collect inside the restored drainage channels exactly as the original design intended. Instead of spreading randomly across the field, the runoff followed the shallow path carved decades earlier, moving calmly toward the creek beyond the eastern fence. It was working perfectly. What worried me was not the rain. It was the sound that arrived a few minutes later. Another diesel engine echoed from the temporary entrance. Then another. Then another. I walked toward the pasture and immediately saw the first cement truck approaching the restored crossing. Every warning sign remained standing exactly where I had placed it. Bright orange markers lined both sides of the drainage channel, and reflective tape shimmered through the light rain. The driver slowed noticeably as he reached the crossing. I watched him stop completely before speaking with someone over his radio. Moments later, a white sport utility vehicle arrived behind him. Diane Collins stepped out holding an umbrella and spoke briefly with the driver. I was too far away to hear their conversation, but I clearly saw her point toward the subdivision before returning to her vehicle. The truck eased forward. The front wheels crossed safely because the channel had been designed with gradual slopes, but the saturated clay beneath the heavier rear axles reacted differently after days of repeated unauthorized traffic. The soil compressed, shifted, and settled naturally beneath the tremendous weight until the rear tires sank deep enough that the truck could no longer move under its own power. The driver immediately stopped trying to force it forward and climbed out to inspect the situation. No collision occurred. No sudden collapse happened. The truck simply became firmly lodged where overloaded equipment should never have been traveling in the first place. Instead of turning the remaining vehicles around, another cement truck attempted to approach from a slightly different angle, hoping firmer ground existed a few yards away. The result was nearly identical. The water flowing through the restored drainage corridor had softened the surrounding clay exactly as generations of experience said it would, and the second truck gradually settled into the saturated soil before coming to a complete stop. By the time a third driver cautiously entered the pasture, construction supervisors were waving frantically, trying to coordinate equipment already scattered across the field. That truck also lost traction after crossing ground weakened by repeated heavy traffic and increasing rainfall. Within less than an hour, 3 cement trucks stood motionless across my pasture, while rainwater continued flowing peacefully beneath them through the restored drainage system. I never celebrated what I was seeing because stranded equipment meant expensive delays for people simply trying to do their jobs. The drivers remained calm, stayed safely inside designated work areas, and immediately contacted their supervisors for assistance. I quietly recorded everything from the edge of my property, making certain every warning sign, every survey marker, every timestamp, and every inch of the restored drainage channel appeared clearly in the video. As the rain continued falling, I looked toward the orange stakes that had first caught my attention days earlier. They were still standing beside the channel, but now they no longer looked like markers for a convenient shortcut. They looked like silent witnesses patiently waiting for the truth to catch up with everyone who had ignored them. Within an hour, the quiet pasture had transformed into something that looked more like an engineering inspection than a construction site. County officials arrived first after receiving reports that multiple commercial vehicles had become immobilized on private property during active rainfall. Shortly afterward, representatives from the construction company, an insurance adjuster, and 2 civil engineers walked carefully along the edge of the restored drainage channel, avoiding the saturated ground while documenting every detail with cameras and measuring equipment. I stayed exactly where I belonged, standing on my side of the fence with a folder containing certified surveys, drainage permits, dated photographs, and the continuous video recordings I had captured since the first unauthorized truck crossed my pasture. Diane Collins stepped out of her vehicle with the same confidence I had seen all week, but this time she was surrounded by professionals asking questions that could only be answered with documents instead of opinions. One engineer examined the restored drainage channel before comparing its dimensions to a printed county drawing. Another used a survey-grade GPS unit to verify the location of the property line and the drainage corridor. After nearly an hour of measurements, they quietly exchanged notes, and I noticed something change in the atmosphere. Nobody was debating whether the drainage channel belonged there anymore. They were now trying to determine why heavy construction traffic had been routed across it despite the official site plans showing an entirely different construction entrance nearly 2 miles away. The insurance investigator requested copies of my photographs, then asked whether I had documented the warning signs before the rainfall began. I handed him printed images showing the reflective markers, the temporary notices, the orange stakes, and the timestamps from the previous afternoon. He compared the photographs with the physical signs still standing beside the drainage channel and simply nodded before placing everything into his evidence folder. One construction supervisor approached me privately and admitted he had raised concerns after I showed him the county maps several days earlier. He explained that the original approved access road had become congested, and someone higher in the chain of command decided using my pasture would save valuable time. He also confirmed that no written authorization allowing access across my ranch had ever been provided to his crew. As the rain finally began easing, recovery equipment arrived to remove the stranded trucks using methods designed to minimize additional damage to the field. The operation moved slowly because every engineer on site wanted to preserve the existing conditions until the documentation process was complete. Nobody argued with me. Nobody accused me of creating a trap because the restored drainage channel matched county records filed decades before the subdivision even existed. Every measurement, every photograph, and every official document pointed toward the same conclusion. The land had behaved exactly as it was engineered to behave once excessive weight repeatedly crossed saturated soil. Late that afternoon, one of the county engineers walked over carrying both the original drainage survey and the current construction plans. He thanked me for preserving the historic records maintained by my family and explained that they perfectly matched the documents stored in the county archive. Before leaving, he looked across the pasture toward the temporary entrance cut through my fence and quietly remarked that shortcuts often become the most expensive route when people ignore the purpose of the land beneath them. As I watched the last inspection vehicle disappear down the county road, I realized the story was no longer about 3 stranded cement trucks. It had become a carefully documented record of decisions, and every decision was leading investigators toward the same people who believed convenience could replace permission. 3 weeks later, I walked into the county courthouse carrying the same worn leather folder that had traveled with me since the first afternoon I found cement trucks crossing my pasture. Nothing inside had changed except the number of documents it contained. What had started with a few photographs and certified plats had grown into engineering reports, insurance findings, survey confirmations, weather records, drone images, and sworn statements from construction supervisors. Every new page reinforced the same simple fact. My ranch had never been approved as a construction access route. The hearing itself remained calm and professional. There were no dramatic speeches or angry confrontations. Instead, every side was asked to explain how heavy commercial vehicles had entered private property that was clearly excluded from every approved development plan. Representatives from the construction company testified first. They acknowledged that the official construction entrance identified in the county permits remained on the eastern side of the subdivision and admitted that using my pasture had been considered a temporary solution to reduce delays. When asked whether written authorization had ever been obtained from me, the answer was a straightforward no. The county engineer then presented enlarged copies of the original drainage plans alongside the photographs taken during the inspection after the rainfall. Every contour, every elevation, and every drainage channel matched the historical records preserved by both the county archives and my family's files. He explained that restoring the drainage system had returned the land to its legally documented condition rather than altering it. The insurance investigator followed by presenting the sequence of photographs showing reflective warning markers, temporary notices, and clearly visible restored drainage channels installed before the weather changed. Timestamp after timestamp established the same timeline I had documented from the beginning. The warning signs existed before the rain. The restored drainage existed before the trucks entered. The trucks crossed anyway. Diane Collins maintained that everyone believed the shortcut would only be used briefly and that no harm had been intended. The judge listened carefully before asking a question that filled the courtroom with complete silence. He asked whether convenience had ever replaced property rights under county law. No one offered a different interpretation because no such rule existed. Certified survey maps were displayed next to aerial drone photographs, making the property boundaries unmistakably clear. The temporary opening through my fence appeared nowhere on any approved construction drawing. The orange survey stakes that once looked official were identified as unofficial field markers placed only to guide traffic, carrying no legal authority whatsoever. By the end of the hearing, the findings became remarkably straightforward. The restored drainage system complied with recorded county plans. My warning signs had been reasonable and visible. The commercial vehicles entered private property without legal permission, and the resulting delays, recovery costs, and equipment expenses flowed from that unauthorized decision rather than from any action I had taken. The court ordered compensation for the documented damage to my pasture, required the unauthorized entrance through my fence to be permanently removed, and directed all future construction traffic to use the approved county access road identified in the original permits. As everyone slowly gathered their paperwork and prepared to leave, I looked across the courtroom at Diane Collins. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, she was not pointing anyone toward my land. She was quietly studying the same county maps that had been available from the very beginning, finally realizing that the smallest orange stake beside an old drainage channel had never represented authority. It had simply marked the place where the truth had been waiting all along. Several months have passed since the last construction vehicle left the edge of my pasture, and on quiet mornings I still walk the same stretch of land where everything changed. The tire ruts disappeared long ago beneath fresh grass. The damaged fence was rebuilt stronger than before, and the restored drainage channels now look exactly the way they did when my father first showed them to me years ago. After a few steady rains, clear water once again followed the gentle path carved into the ranch decades earlier, flowing calmly toward the creek without flooding the fields or washing away the soil. Watching that familiar pattern return brought a kind of satisfaction no courtroom ruling could ever provide. The construction company completed a permanent access road using the route originally approved by the county, and every delivery truck now entered the subdivision exactly where the official plans had always intended. It took a little more time for drivers to reach the job site, but no one questioned the route again because everyone finally understood why property lines and engineering drawings existed in the first place. The compensation ordered by the court helped restore the damaged pasture, replace fencing, and improve several sections of the drainage system that my father had hoped to modernize someday. I chose to invest every dollar back into the ranch because this land had never been about winning an argument. It had always been about protecting something that would outlive me. Thomas Grady visited again after the restoration work was complete, and together we stood beside the same drainage channel where he had warned me that nature always followed its own rules. He smiled as he watched water moving quietly through the restored corridor and said that good engineering rarely attracts attention because it simply does its job year after year. I thought about those words often because they reminded me of my father, who believed the strongest foundations were usually the ones nobody noticed until someone tried to ignore them. I also learned through neighbors that Diane Collins eventually stepped away from her leadership position within the Homeowners Association. A new board adopted clearer procedures requiring written approval for any activity involving neighboring properties, and regular meetings with surrounding landowners became part of their planning process. From everything I heard, those conversations were far more productive than assumptions had ever been. Occasionally, I still notice families walking along the edge of the subdivision near the county road, and many of them wave as they pass the ranch. Some even stop to admire the old barn or ask about the history of the property. I always welcome respectful visitors because good neighbors are built through conversations, not shortcuts. Every now and then someone asks whether I planned everything that happened after the trucks crossed my pasture, and I always give the same answer. I never planned for anyone to become stranded. I only restored what had already existed and trusted the truth to remain exactly where it belonged. The orange survey stake that first caught my attention now rests inside my workshop beside my father's handwritten drainage sketch. One represents an assumption that disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. The other represents knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Every time I see them together, I remember that the greatest protection a person can have is not louder words or greater power. It is understanding the value of what they have been entrusted to preserve, because justice is rarely loud. It is patient, carefully documented, firmly rooted, and as dependable as the land that remembers every honest hand that has cared for it.